Midnight. A wooden barrack somewhere in occupied Poland. A guard's boots crunch on gravel outside, slow, deliberate, getting closer. Inside, a British soldier sits perfectly still in the dark, one earpiece pressed so hard against his skull it leaves a mark. In his hands, a device made of a broken razor blade, a pencil lead, a stolen wire, and a scrap of German soap tin. If the guard opens that door and sees what's in his hands, there will be no trial. No court-martial. No mercy. There is only one sentence for a prisoner caught with a radio in a German POW camp, and it isn't prison. It's a bullet. And yet, night after night, in barracks across Nazi Germany, men build these machines anyway. Out of nothing. With nothing. Risking everything, for one single reason. They need to know if the world outside those fences still believes they're going to win. This is the true story of the men who turned junk into a lifeline, and one soldier whose hidden radio still exists today, sitting in a museum case in England, a century-old whisper from a war most people think they already understand. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a razor blade and a pencil could outthink the Gestapo. Let's rewind. Stalag VIII-B. A prisoner of war camp built by the Germans in what was then Lambsdorff, Germany, today WWII, Poland. At its peak, it held tens of thousands of Allied prisoners, British, Commonwealth, and later American soldiers, crammed into rows of wooden huts behind double barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and machine guns. Most of the British soldiers who ended up here were captured early, Dunkirk in 1940, North Africa, Greece, Crete. Men who thought they'd be home by Christmas found themselves, instead, staring down years of captivity with no end date in sight. Prisoner of war life wasn't the cartoon version people imagine from old movies, tunnels and vaulting horses and cheeky escapes. For most men, most days, it was cold. It was hungry. It was boring in a way that ate at a person from the inside. Red Cross parcels, when they came, were survival. Roll calls happened twice a day, sometimes more, prisoners lined up in the freezing air while guards counted heads over and over, making sure nobody had slipped away in the night. But the worst part wasn't the hunger. It wasn't even the cold. It was the silence. These men had no idea what was happening in the war. None. The only news the Germans allowed them was German news, carefully filtered, carefully twisted, designed to convince British and Commonwealth prisoners that the war was already lost. Propaganda posters on camp walls. German newspapers claiming victory after victory. Guards taunting prisoners with headlines about British ships sunk, British cities burning, British defeat just around the corner. Imagine that. Not knowing if your country still exists in any meaningful way. Not knowing if the invasion everyone whispered about had happened yet, or failed. Not knowing if you were fighting for a cause that was already dead, or one that was about to win. For men who had already lost their freedom, this was the second imprisonment. A cage built entirely out of not knowing. And that's exactly why, in camp after camp, a very specific kind of rebellion started to take shape. Not with guns. Not with tunnels, although those happened too. This rebellion was quieter, and in some ways far more dangerous. Prisoners started trying to build radios. Not smuggle them in. Build them. From scratch. Inside a camp where guards searched huts, searched mattresses, searched the linings of coats, where informers sometimes lived among the prisoners themselves, and where the punishment for possession wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was execution as a spy. The Germans made that policy brutally clear. A radio in enemy hands wasn't a comfort item. It was treated as an active instrument of war, because it was. Because the moment prisoners knew the true state of the war, the Germans lost their most powerful psychological weapon, hopelessness. So why would any man risk his life for a homemade radio? Because hope, in a place like that, wasn't a feeling. It was a resource. And resources that scarce are worth dying for. Here's the part that should genuinely blow your mind. These radios weren't built with spare parts smuggled in from London. Almost everything came from inside the wire, camp guards, camp garbage, camp rations, twisted into something they were never meant to be. The basic design most prisoners used was called a crystal set. No batteries needed. No power source at all. In fact, the radio waves themselves provided just enough energy to vibrate a tiny earpiece. That made it perfect for a POW camp, because a battery-powered set needed constant recharging, and recharging left evidence. A crystal set could sit dormant for weeks, completely dead to the eye, and come alive in seconds. But building one from nothing meant solving 4 brutal engineering problems with whatever scraps a starving man could find. Problem 1, the aerial. You need something to catch the radio signal. Prisoners used stripped copper wire pulled from camp electrical fittings, sometimes fishing line woven with thin wire, strung along rooftops or hidden inside gutters where a guard's eye would just slide right past it. Problem 2, the earpiece. Some men traded cigarettes, the real underground currency of every POW camp, for a spare set of German aviators' headphones. Cigarettes could buy almost anything from a bored, underpaid guard willing to look the other way for a smoke. Problem 3, the tuning coil. This was often wound by hand around anything cylindrical, a broom handle, toothbrush handle, even a cardboard tube, using wire painstakingly stripped from discarded equipment. Problem 4, and the cleverest one, the detector. This is the part that actually pulls a usable signal out of the air, and prisoners built it using something called a cat's whisker, a fine wire pressed against a crystal, sometimes a chunk of galena, sometimes, remarkably, the tip of a used razor blade touched against a pencil lead. A razor blade. A pencil. That's not folklore, that's documented, verified engineering, built by men with no formal training, working from memory and improvisation alone. Once assembled, the entire device had to be small enough to vanish. Prisoners hid finished radios inside hollow table legs, inside soap dishes, sewn into the lining of greatcoats, buried inside loaves of bread, and, in one now famous case from a different camp, carried piece by piece inside a set of bagpipes during a forced march, so that no single man ever carried a complete, incriminating radio at once. Now picture the object this video opened with, a genuine crystal wireless set, hidden by British prisoners at Stalag VIII-B, used to secretly follow BBC broadcasts of the war's progress. It was donated after the war by a King's Royal Rifle Corps rifleman named Wilborn, and today it sits preserved in a British regimental museum, a physical, touchable piece of evidence that this wasn't a legend. Men in that exact camp built exactly this kind of device, kept it alive for months or years, and used it to do something the Germans had explicitly, violently forbidden. They listened to the truth. And once a radio was built, the real operation began, because building it was actually the easy part. Getting a working radio was step 1. Keeping it hidden, keeping it functioning, and getting the news out to thousands of men without getting caught, that was a full operation, run with almost military precision, inside a military prison. Every camp that managed to sustain a hidden radio developed the same basic system, refined through trial and painful error. First, security. Before the radio ever came out of its hiding place, lookouts were posted, prisoners the Germans nicknamed stooges, positioned at doors and windows, watching for German guards the prisoners called ferrets, men whose entire job was sniffing out contraband and tunnels. If a ferret approached, a signal would run down the hut in seconds, and the radio would disappear back into its table leg or its soap dish before a hand ever touched the door. Second, the listening. Usually late at night, when the camp was quiet and the Germans assumed everyone was asleep, one man, often the one with the steadiest hands and the best hearing, would put in the earpiece and tune, painfully slowly, searching through static for the frequency carrying the BBC's overseas service from London. And when that signal came through clean, even for a few minutes, something happened to the men in that hut that's almost impossible to describe. The most trusted voice in the whole miserable ordeal, a British newsreader speaking calmly across hundreds of miles of occupied Europe, telling them the truth their captors had spent months trying to bury. Third, transcription. The listener would take the broadcast down, often in shorthand, sometimes scrawled directly onto a scrap of paper, capturing troop movements, bombing campaigns, political developments, anything that told the real shape of the war. That transcript was smuggled into the daylight hours and quietly copied, block by block, hut by hut. Fourth, and maybe the most theatrical part, distribution. In some camps, one prisoner in each block would be responsible for reading the news aloud, quietly, to small huddled groups, checking constantly for anyone approaching. And when the reading was finished, the paper itself was destroyed. Not torn up and thrown in a bin. Eaten. Swallowed, so that even if a surprise search happened 5 minutes later, there would be no evidence, no handwriting, nothing at all to trace back to a hidden radio. Some camps went even further, producing entire underground camp newspapers built almost entirely from these secretly gathered broadcasts, hand-copied bulletins passed hut to hut, carrying real war news dressed up as morale-boosting camp gossip so a passing guard would think nothing of it. Think about the discipline that took. Starving men who hadn't had a proper meal in months, running a covert intelligence and broadcasting network with better operational security than some professional spy rings, because they understood, instinctively, that one slip meant a firing squad. And the Germans knew radios existed. They knew it constantly. Surprise searches, called goon raids, by prisoners, tore through barracks regularly, guards ripping apart mattresses, prying up floorboards, checking table legs with the exact same suspicion prisoners had learned to exploit. Some radios were found. Some men paid the price the Germans had promised, solitary confinement in the best cases, transferred to a punishment camp in the worst, and in isolated documented cases across the wider POW system, execution. And still, when a radio was discovered and destroyed, prisoners built another one. Because by that point in the war, the truth wasn't a luxury anymore. It was oxygen. It's worth pausing here and asking the question a lot of people watching this are probably thinking, was it really worth dying for a radio broadcast? Couldn't these men have just waited it out? To answer that, you have to understand what information does to a human mind under captivity. Psychologically, prisoners of war held for years faced something modern researchers now recognize clearly. Prolonged uncertainty is one of the most corrosive experiences a human mind can endure. Not knowing when, or if, an ordeal will end is, in documented studies of captivity, often described by survivors as harder to bear than physical hardship itself. The mind needs an anchor. A timeline. A reason to believe tomorrow is different from today. German camp propaganda understood this perfectly, and weaponized it. Every fake headline, every staged newspaper claiming German victory, was designed to erode that anchor, to make prisoners believe there was no light at the end of any tunnel, so why bother resisting, why bother hoping, why bother staying disciplined and dignified at all? The secret radios were the direct countermeasure. Every confirmed Allied victory, every piece of real Normandy news after June 1944, every scrap of evidence that the war machine grinding through Europe was now moving in the Allies' favor, it gave men something the Germans could never confiscate, a reason to believe the wait had an ending, and that ending was coming. There's a reason survivors, decades later, described radio nights with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious experience. In multiple camps across occupied Europe, prisoners have recounted the same feeling, a room full of exhausted, starving men going utterly silent, listening to a crackling voice from London, feeling for a few minutes like they weren't forgotten. Like home hadn't given up on them. And there's a brutal irony worth sitting with, the very people who should have been most broken by captivity, cut off, starved, humiliated, controlled down to the minute of their day, were the ones who built and ran one of the most sophisticated grassroots intelligence networks of the entire war. With razor blades. With pencil lead. With soap tins and broom handles. No formal training. No equipment. No support. Just absolute refusal to let their captors control the one thing that was actually theirs, the truth. Point 2. As 1944 turned into 1945, the news coming through those hidden earpieces changed. It wasn't cautious anymore. It was unmistakable. Allied troops pushing through France. The Rhine crossed. The Red Army closing in from the east. For prisoners who had spent years starved of real information, the secret radios became something extraordinary in those final months, an early warning system, tracking the front lines as they crept closer and closer to their own camp fences. Some camps used that radio intelligence to prepare for the chaos of the war's final weeks, the forced marches the Germans undertook as Allied forces approached from both directions, marches that killed prisoners through exposure and starvation as camps were evacuated ahead of the advancing armies. Men who knew roughly where the front lines actually were had a better chance of surviving those brutal final marches than men moving blind. And then, finally, in the camps that made it to the end, the guards vanishing overnight, watchtowers left empty, gates swinging open with nobody left to stop anyone walking through them. For the men who had spent years building, hiding, and defending their secret radios, that moment wasn't a surprise. In a strange way, they'd been listening to it arrive for months. After the war, most of these radios didn't survive as objects. They were makeshift, fragile things, built to disappear the second danger approached, and many prisoners dismantled or destroyed them the moment they were no longer needed, or simply lost them in the chaos of liberation and repatriation. But some survived. Carried home, quietly, by men who couldn't quite let go of the thing that had kept them sane. The Stalag VIII-B crystal set that opened this story is one of those rare survivors, donated decades later to a British regimental museum, where it sits today, a scrap of tin, wire, and a razor blade that once carried the entire outside world into a starving man's ear. It's easy to walk past an object like that in a display case and see nothing but junk. Old wire. Rusted metal. A cracked earpiece. But once you know what it actually was, a lifeline built out of nothing, powered by nothing but radio waves themselves and the sheer will of men who refuse to be told what to believe, it stops looking like junk. It starts looking like one of the most quietly heroic pieces of engineering to come out of the entire Second World War. There's no statue for these men. No blockbuster movie built entirely around a soap dish radio. Most of their names were never recorded at all, just the men of Stalag VIII-B, a footnote in a much bigger war. But think about what they actually did. Locked behind barbed wire, starved, watched constantly, told every single day that their side was losing, and they built, by hand, a working radio receiver out of a razor blade and a pencil, and used it to hold on to the truth until the truth finally caught up and set them free. That's not just a story about electronics. That's a story about what people are capable of when hope is the only weapon they have left, and they refuse to put it down. If this story hit you the way it hit me putting it together, hit subscribe, because there are hundreds more stories like this one,